Murder,
shootings,
violence,
stab wounds,
homicide,
were shot, the victim,
and the drowning,
suffocated.
I'm standing about 10 feet from his dead body.
So my name is Cordelia Willis, and I am a criminalist at the Santa Clara County Crime Laboratory, and I have worked here for over 20 years.
The main evidence found was a bloody footprint and a photograph of a tire track. What would be the first step in dealing with this kind of evidence?
So the first step that we would do at a crime scene is we would want to properly document the footprint and the tire print. So what we would do is at the scene, we would take photographs in a certain way with a scale in the photographs, and then use the camera so we're facing straight down, not at an angle. And that way, by taking photographs that way, when we get back to the laboratory, we can then print it out one-to-one, so we can then recreate exactly the size of the shoe print and the tire track, and then we can later do comparisons to it. So that would be the first step, is to document it properly. And then if there was already a suspect, we could then compare the shoe print and the tire track to the shoes and tires from that suspect. If there wasn't a suspect, then we could try to possibly find out the make and model of the shoes and tires in order to then give information to the investigators of what they might be wanting to look for.
Okay, so our second question is, how long does it usually take to identify DNA in blood with today's technology?
So to analyze DNA in blood, or really any of the body fluids, it's kind of the same. And the actual physical process of analyzing the DNA, the way we do it in our lab, the physical process itself, if you just do it straight, working, staying awake all night, you don't have to wait for the instruments, you can just work straight through. That physical process takes about a day and a half. Now, that usually doesn't happen. Usually what happens is we batch our analyses, so that we do, we'll look at a bunch of evidence and take cuttings and swabs, and then we'll do a bunch of extractions together, and then we'll do a bunch of the next step together, and the next step. And so that process, the way we normally handle cases, is going to take more about like a month to get the DNA work finished. And that's assuming that we can work straight through, when we don't have trainings and classes, and we don't have to wait for instruments, or the instruments aren't broken or whatever. And so oftentimes it takes way more than a month. And we have other cases that we're finishing up too, so it might be a while before we even get started. But in general, most cases, it's going to be at least a month to get the DNA results. But if it's a rush case, there's a loose serial killer, and they need the data as soon as possible, we can have people stay overnight and work on it and get results in about a day and a half.
Is there a certain amount of DNA they have to acquire in order to do this process?
Yeah, so we obviously need enough DNA, or enough of a body fluid in order to get the DNA, but we don't need a lot. So if you think about like pins that are used in sewing, the little head of the pin, that's about the size of a blood stain that we need. We don't need much blood. Other references, if you're drinking out of a water bottle, just swabbing the surface of the water bottle, that's enough saliva for us to get DNA. So we don't need a lot of DNA in order to, or not a lot of body fluid in order to do the testing, but we do have to have some.
Okay, so the next question is, what is the most common piece of DNA traced in evidence found in crime scenes?
It kind of depends on what sort of crime we're talking about. So with burglaries, the drink of choice in Santa Clara County for burglaries is Red Bull. So people, they break into a house, they're stealing people's computers and cell phones and everything, and they're drinking Red Bull, and they leave the Red Bull cans behind. And then we can do the DNA on the saliva from the Red Bull can and solve the crime.
If a person is trying to cover up their DNA and say that they were to do this, like so you guys can find the DNA, what is the next step?
So, I mean, DNA helps, obviously if you leave behind your DNA, that's going to be able to help us track you down, but everyone leaves behind a lot of things that they don't realize. And people leave fingerprints behind, so some people are smart, they use gloves, but a lot of times criminals, they don't quite think through things, so they'll wear gloves so that their fingerprints aren't left in things, and then they'll leave their gloves behind, and then we can do DNA on the gloves. That's not the only thing that gets left behind, and so you leave shoe prints behind, you leave tire tracks behind, you may shed hair that you don't realize, and we may be able to find that. So there's lots of evidence that can be left behind that people don't realize that they're leaving.
How do you go out and find them?
Okay.
Like, how do you
Yeah.
know it's them?
No, that's a really good question. So when we do our DNA analysis, basically we end up with a chart full of numbers. And it's just a chart full of numbers. It doesn't tell us anything about the person. It doesn't tell us how tall they are or what color of hair they have or anything like that. So basically it's kind of like your own personal barcode, and that's it. So we have to have something to compare it to. So what we can do is, if we have a suspect, then obviously we can test the suspect's blood and compare it, or their DNA and compare it. If we don't have a suspect, then we can put it into the criminal database. So we have a criminal database that is run by the FBI, and we enter DNA profiles into the database here at the local level, and then they get searched at both the state level and at the national level every single week. And so if anyone has committed a crime, or in certain states, in California, if you're arrested, you are required to give a DNA sample, and so then that will be in the database and that will be searched. And so that's how we catch a lot of burglars, because they leave their Red Bull can behind. We get the DNA, which is a series of numbers, we enter that into the database, and usually these burglars, this isn't their first time committing a crime, so they've already been arrested or been found guilty for something, and so now that gets their DNA is in the database, and so then it hits. One of the things that then they kind of expanded was they said, okay, well, we know that DNA from family members can be similar. So could we maybe search the criminal database for close relations and see if maybe we could solve some crimes that way? They came up with this whole policy where you could then try to do a search to see if you had a near match. So not a full match of the DNA, but so you have most of the barcode, but not all of it. And then we would expect family members to have very similar DNA. So from there, they could go and figure out, okay, could this possibly be a family member? But that only works if you have a family member, a close family member, who is in the database. So then, just last year was when this new thing broke, which is called genetic genealogy. And they realized that a lot of people right now are paying to have people do their DNA. So the DNA that is tested for sites like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, that's different DNA testing than we do. So it's all from your DNA, but at the crime lab, we're trying to individualize a person. So we're testing areas of the DNA which are individual. Whereas those ancestry sites, they obviously are trying to match you up with your ancestors, so they're testing sites that are going to be similar within a family. That's not helpful usually for crimes, right? Because we want to know that it's Bob Smith and not Frank Smith who committed this crime. So if with the DNA testing that we do at the lab, it's to try to find an individual. But for the ancestry sites, they're looking at a different part of the DNA, which helps you find your family.
Okay, so all 4 members of the Clutter family were shot with a shotgun. So what information could you obtain from the crime scene involving the gun and the wounds and stuff?
Okay, well, with firearms, if you have a gun that's firing a bullet, then those guns have what's called rifling inside the barrel, and it will mark up any projectiles that you fire through it. So you fire a bullet through a pistol or a revolver, and it's going to get rifling marks on it, and those rifling marks are kind of like a fingerprint, and they're unique. So if you have a bullet, great. With shotguns, unfortunately, you don't have that. Shotguns are just firing a bunch of lead balls all at the same time. I like to think of shotguns as like you picking up a handful of rocks and throwing it, and you're just kind of hoping that some of them hit, so you're not as concerned about aim or anything. And so with the shotgun, unfortunately, you can't necessarily, just with the shot itself, you can't trace it back to the weapon that fired it. But the cartridge that it came in, so the shotgun shell that you loaded into the gun, it probably was left behind at the scene, and that's going to have a bunch of markings on it that are unique. And so then you can use that to try to trace it back to the firearm. And nowadays, we have a firearms database as well. So we have the DNA database, we also have a firearms database in which we can put in cartridge casings and shells and bullets, fired bullets, and then try to match those up and figure out if we've seen another case that used the same weapon. So again, we have to have, it has to have already been used in a crime or been collected as suspected have been involved in the crime for it to be in the database. But a lot of guns are reused for crimes, and so therefore we can track a lot of firearms through that.
Okay, so you've mentioned DNA and how they poured detergent on the gloves and you still were able to get the DNA. Is there any surface that wouldn't allow you
for fingerprints?
to produce? Yeah.
So with fingerprints, you're leaving behind the ridge pattern that's on your fingers, and so the ridge pattern is going to print really well on a surface like this counter, right? That's going to make a nice copy of it. If I did it on a paper-like thing, it's actually going to leave, it's the oils and water that's in the print, it's actually going to soak into the paper, and so we can actually use chemicals on the paper to soak in and detect fingerprints on surfaces like paper. So fingerprints don't really show up very well on, let's say, fabric, because it's not a flat surface and there's nowhere to really mark, the shape of it, and it's not going to soak into the fabric the way it is into paper, because with fabric it's got all of this, it's woven, it has all sorts of different things, and so it's not going to just nicely soak in the pattern it was in. However, we still could possibly get DNA from that fingerprint that's on here. So we're not going to see the ridge patterns that are on fabric, but we could get DNA from the skin cells that were left behind in that fingerprint.
Is there technology being developed to increase the ability to identify more types of evidence? You mentioned the ancestry, but is there more?
Yeah, I mean, all the time they're always coming up with new things for crime scenes, and so better lighting systems. So in the old days they had old bad flashlights that didn't work really well, and now they have much better flashlights that shine much brighter light, so you can look in the dark areas. You can also, there's the crime lights, which is what they're called. They're just fancy flashlights. But anyway, crime lights, they also can shine a specific color of light, which that helps detect certain things. So certain body fluids like semen and saliva and even urine and feces, they'll actually fluoresce if you shine like a blue light on them and wear orange goggles. And so we can do that. And so that is developed right now, but they're always coming up with like better ways, stronger flashlights, better things to do with that. There's so much digital stuff. So, 20 years ago, there weren't any databases the way there are now because they just didn't have really the computers to do those databases. Whereas now, the firearms database, they're taking digital photos. Well, 20 years ago, digital photos didn't really exist. So they couldn't have the firearms database, whereas now they do. So they're always coming up with new technology that can help with crimes. But you still need to have investigators who kind of know what to look for and, who take the time to do a good job.
Okay, so now that we have shown you our research, we can now connect it back to the clutter murder and tell you about what they would have to do to get away with the murder with today's forensics.
Okay, so the evidence that they found was a tire track and a shoe print. And as for development, there has been no advancements in this category, as they can only match up a shoe print with a shoe, and they can't get that shoe unless they have suspects. Same with the tire. You need the car to prove that the tire tracks match up. Yeah, they're the exact same. Otherwise, you can't match it up.
One advancement that we have made is there's now a database, so every time you get arrested or you get put into jail, you are put into this database, and if anything ever happens and they find DNA, they can now match you to using the database. So we know that these murderers were previously arrested, so if they found any kind of DNA of any sort, they would put it in the database and they would automatically get a match and they would easily get an arrest.
As well as the 2 points that they brought up, with today's modern forensics, the murderers would have to been very careful with covering up their hair and wearing gloves. They would need to wear a hairnet in order to cover up any hair follicles that could fall on the ground, because especially with the root, it's really easy to take DNA from, and with fingerprints and skin cells, those can easily end up on any surface or fabric. So both of these would need to be covered as well. They would need to make sure they take the gloves with them and take the hairnet with them, because yes, wearing a hairnet and gloves works, but if you leave them at the crime scene, you're doing the same thing that you would have done without them. So especially with these, if you don't wear a hairnet or gloves, the murderers would have been caught very easily.
Alright, so throughout the book, there's also the claim brought up many times that he did not rape Nancy, but in today's society, they would be able to figure that out through matching semen with the murderer, and it would be simple to accuse him of that or accuse him not of. So nowadays, they'd be able to based on the technological advances.